Her mother gave her away at 21. The disabled mountain man's reaction shocked all the wind, howled through Cotton Hollow like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter cold of a Montana winter that seemed determined to freeze the very soul out of anyone foolish enough to brave it. The year was 1884, and in this forgotten corner of the frontier, where the Rocky Mountains rose like jagged teeth against an unforgiving sky, survival was the only currency that mattered. Sarah Bell Carson stood at the window of the cramped cabin she shared with her mother, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy flakes that blanketed the world in white silence. At 21, she had learned to make herself small in a world that constantly reminded her she took up too much space. The townspeople of Cotton Hollow had made sure of that, their whispers following her like shadows whenever she ventured into town for supplies. "The Carson girl," they would say, voices dripping with contempt. "Poor thing! Who'd ever want her?" Her mother, Margaret Carson, sat hunched over the table, counting and recounting the few coins they had left. The lines on her face had deepened over the past year, etched there by poverty and bitterness in equal measure. Since Sarah's father had died in a hunting accident 3 years ago, their situation had grown increasingly desperate. The small pension they received was barely enough to keep them fed, and the debts kept mounting. "Sarah," Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Come here." Sarah turned from the window, her heart sinking at the tone in her mother's voice. She recognized it, the cold calculation that had been creeping into Margaret's words more and more frequently lately. "Yes, Mama?" Margaret looked up, her eyes hard and devoid of warmth. "I've made arrangements. There's a man up on Coldwater Ridge, Elias Stone. He needs someone to keep house for him, and we need money. You'll go to him tomorrow." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Mama, I don't understand. You're sending me to work for him?" "Not work," Margaret said flatly. "You'll be his wife. He's agreed to pay off our debts in exchange. It's already settled." The room spun. Sarah gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. You're selling me?" "Don't be dramatic," Margaret snapped. "I'm securing our future. You think anyone else would have you? At least this way, you'll have a roof over your head, and I'll be able to survive the winter. The man's a cripple anyway, lost the use of his leg in some accident. You should be grateful he's willing to take you." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of her mother, not when it would only confirm what Margaret had always believed, that Sarah was weak, burdensome, unworthy of the space she occupied in the world. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as moonlight filtered through the cracks in the walls. She thought of her father, who had taught her to track animals through the forest, who had shown her which plants were edible and which were poison, who had told her stories by the fire about brave pioneers and the untamed wilderness. He had never made her feel like she was too much or not enough. He had simply loved her. But he was gone, and now she was being cast out like an unwanted piece of furniture, traded for the price of survival. The next morning dawned gray and bitter. Margaret loaded Sarah's few possessions, a worn dress, a shawl, her father's hunting knife, and a small sewing kit, into a canvas bag. A man named Tucker, who ran the general store and occasionally did odd jobs for cash, arrived with his wagon to transport Sarah to Coldwater Ridge. The journey took 3 hours, winding up narrow mountain paths where the wheels of the wagon creaked and groaned against the frozen ground. Tucker said nothing the entire time, his jaw working a piece of tobacco as he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sarah sat in the back, clutching her bag, feeling like a prisoner being transported to an execution. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Sarah's first thought was that it looked lonely. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a structure of weathered logs with a stone chimney from which a thin curl of smoke rose. The place was neat and well maintained, but there was an air of isolation about it that made her chest tighten. Tucker pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, not bothering to help Sarah as she scrambled out. He walked up to the door and knocked. 3 sharp raps that echoed in the mountain silence. The door opened slowly, and Sarah got her first look at Elias Stone. He was a large man, perhaps in his early 50s, with broad shoulders and a powerful build that spoke of years of hard labor. His hair was more gray than brown, pulled back in a rough tie at his neck, and his face was lined and weathered like the bark of an ancient tree. But it was his eyes that struck her, deep brown, filled with a sadness so profound it seemed to pull at something inside her chest. He leaned heavily on a carved wooden cane, his right leg clearly unable to bear his full weight. When he saw Sarah standing there, his expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like pain. "Mr. Stone," Tucker said, spitting tobacco juice onto the snow, "brought you the Carson girl, as arranged. Her mother says everything's settled. The girl's yours now." The words made Sarah feel like merchandise being delivered. She kept her eyes on the ground, unable to look at the man who had purchased her like a sack of flour. "Mrs. Carson said," Tucker continued, but Elias cut him off. "I know what was said." His voice was deep and quiet, like distant thunder. "You can go?" Tucker shrugged, climbed back onto his wagon, and drove away without a backward glance, leaving Sarah standing alone in the clearing with this stranger who was now somehow her husband. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah could feel Elias's gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet it. Shame and humiliation burned through her like wildfire. This was what her life had come to, abandoned by her mother, given away to a man who probably pitied her at best. Then, to her complete shock, she heard the thump of the cane on the porch, and suddenly Elias was kneeling beside her. The movement must have caused him considerable pain, given his injury, but his face showed only concern as he looked up at her. "Miss Carson," he said gently, "please look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, Sarah raised her eyes to meet his. What she saw there made her breath catch, not disgust or disappointment, but something that looked almost like understanding. "No one," Elias said, his voice firm despite its gentleness, "has the right to throw you away like that. No one has the right to treat you as if you're worth less than any other human being on God's earth." Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. In 21 years of life, no one had ever spoken to her with such simple dignity. "I don't know what arrangement your mother made," Elias continued, "and frankly, I don't care. What matters is this. If you want to stay here, then this is your home. You're not a servant, you're not property, you're not anything except a person who deserves respect and kindness. But if you want to leave, if you want to go somewhere else, I will help you. I'll give you money, I'll find you a safe place, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you have choices. The choice is yours, Miss Carson. It always will be." Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up entirely, and all she could do was sob. Great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. All the pain and rejection and shame she had carried for so long came pouring out, and through it all, Elias simply knelt there in the snow beside her, not touching her, not trying to hush her, just present. When she finally managed to compose herself, wiping her face with the corner of her shawl, she whispered, "I have nowhere else to go." "Then you have a home here," Elias said simply, "for as long as you want it." He used his cane to push himself back to his feet, the effort clearly taxing, and gestured toward the open door. "Come inside. It's too cold to stand out here." The cabin's interior was simple, but surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a fire crackling warmly. There was a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small kitchen area with shelves lined with preserves and dried goods, and 2 doors that Sarah assumed led to bedrooms. Everything was clean and orderly, the work of someone who took care with their surroundings. "The room on the right is yours," Elias said, moving to hang his coat on a peg by the door. "It's small, but there's a good bed and a chest for your things. I'm in the other room. I built a lock for your door, not because I think you need to lock yourself in, but because you should feel safe." Sarah nodded, still unable to form words. She picked up her bag and moved toward the room he'd indicated, pushing open the door to find a space that was indeed small, but warm and welcoming. A quilt in shades of blue and green covered the bed, and a window looked out over the forest. It was more than she'd had at her mother's cabin, where she'd slept on a pallet near the stove. "I'll make some coffee," Elias called from the main room. "Take your time settling in." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Elias existed in a strange, careful dance around each other. They were 2 wounded souls, each carrying damage that made them wary of connection. Sarah had been taught by her mother and by the cruel townspeople that she was unworthy of love, a burden to be endured. Elias, she slowly learned through their quiet conversations over meals, had been abandoned by his wife after his accident, and his former friends had drifted away when he could no longer hunt or work as he once had. Sarah began to notice small things about Elias that moved her in ways she couldn't quite explain. She noticed that he woke before dawn every morning, despite the obvious pain in his leg, to stoke the fire so the cabin would be warm when she emerged from her room. She noticed that he always served her first at meals, giving her the best portions while taking the smaller ones for himself. She noticed the way he spoke to her, never condescending, never pitying, always treating her as an equal worthy of respect. One day, while Elias was outside chopping wood, a task that took him twice as long as it would have taken an able-bodied man, but which he insisted on doing, Sarah was tidying the main room when she discovered a basket tucked under his bed. Inside was a half-finished knitted shawl, the yarn faded and dusty from years of neglect. The pattern was beautiful, intricate, clearly the work of someone who had once cared deeply about the craft. That evening after dinner, Sarah asked about it as gently as she could. Elias's face grew shadowed. "My wife started that," he said quietly, "before the accident. She was going to finish it for our daughter, but—" He paused, staring into the fire. "After I got hurt, she left, took our daughter and went back east to her family." said she couldn't live with a crippled man in the middle of nowhere. The shawl stayed behind, like everything else she didn't want. Sarah felt her heart break for him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Elias shrugged, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago. I've learned to accept it." But accepting something didn't mean it didn't hurt, Sarah thought. She understood that better than anyone. That night, Sarah retrieved the unfinished shawl and her sewing kit. By candlelight, she carefully unpicked the old dusty yarn and began to work it into something new. She couldn't erase the pain of what Elias had lost, but perhaps she could transform it into something different, something that belonged to this new, fragile life they were building together. It took her 3 weeks, working in the evenings after Elias had retired to his room. When it was finished, she folded it carefully and placed it on his chair at the breakfast table one morning. Elias stopped dead when he saw it, his hand moving to touch the soft wool with something like reverence. "Sarah, it's yours," she said softly. I thought maybe it could be something new now. Not a reminder of what was lost, but something for what is." He looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite read, something intense and deep that made her heart race. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Sarah replied, and she realized it was the absolute truth. From that day forward, something shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained began to close inch by inch. Elias started teaching Sarah about the mountain, how to read the weather, how to identify animal tracks, how to predict when the spring thaw would come. Sarah, in turn, used her skills with needle and thread to repair Elias's worn clothes, to make curtains for the windows, to create small touches that made the cabin feel more like a home. But beneath these domestic rhythms, something else was growing, something neither of them dared to name or acknowledge. Sarah found herself watching Elias when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing the strength in his hands as he worked, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to the horses in the small stable behind the cabin, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She would lie awake at night, aware of his presence in the room across the hall, and feel a longing so intense it frightened her. She couldn't love him, she told herself. He had taken her in out of kindness, out of pity perhaps. A man like him, strong, capable, decent, couldn't possibly want someone like her. The thought of confessing her feelings only to see rejection in his eyes was more than she could bear. Elias, for his part, was waging his own internal war. He had never expected to feel this way again, had convinced himself after his wife left that his capacity for love had died along with his ability to walk without pain. But Sarah had awakened something in him he'd thought long buried. Her strength amazed him, the way she had endured such cruelty and emerged still capable of kindness, still willing to care for others despite how badly she'd been treated. Her laugh, rare but genuine when it came, was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The way she hummed while she worked, the care she took with small tasks, the intelligence in her eyes when she asked questions about the world around them, all of it drew him to her like a moth to flame. But he was an old, broken man, he reminded himself constantly. She was young, vital, full of untapped potential. She deserved someone who could give her a real life, not this half-existence in the wilderness with a cripple. The kindest thing he could do was keep his distance, protect her from the burden of his feelings, and hope that someday she might find the happiness she deserved elsewhere. Winter deepened, and with it came the true test of mountain survival. The snows grew so heavy that leaving the cabin became treacherous. They were isolated, cut off from the world, dependent entirely on each other and the supplies they'd laid in. It was during one of these endless white days that Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. She had gone out to the small stable to check on the horses, two sturdy mountain ponies that Elias kept for transportation and hauling, when she heard unusual sounds coming from the storage shed attached to the stable. Moving quietly, she peered through a crack in the wood and saw Elias inside, practicing walking without his cane. He would take a few steps, his face contorted with pain and effort, then rest against the wall before trying again. Over and over he repeated the process, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. He was pushing himself to the point of agony, forcing his damaged leg to bear weight it couldn't comfortably hold. But why? What was he trying to accomplish? She slipped away before he could see her, but the image haunted her. That night, as they ate dinner, she finally asked, "Does your leg hurt very much?" Elias looked up, surprised by the direct question. They'd never really discussed his injury in detail before. "Some days worse than others," he admitted. "Why do you ask?" I worry that you push yourself too hard sometimes." Something flickered in his eyes. "I do what needs to be done." "But maybe you don't need to do as much as you think," Sarah said carefully. "Maybe you could let someone help you more." "I don't want to be a burden," Elias said quietly. And there it was, the same fear that lived in Sarah's own heart, the terror of being too much, of asking for more than one deserved. "You're not a burden," Sarah said firmly. "You've never been a burden. You've been the kindest person I've ever known." Their eyes met across the table, and the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words. For a moment, Sarah thought he might say something, might bridge the gap that separated them. But then Elias looked away, clearing his throat. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than you know." The moment passed, but its echo remained hanging in the air like the last note of a song. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late February, and a storm had been building all day, one of those massive mountain blizzards that could bury everything in its path. By evening, the wind was howling like a living thing, and snow fell so thick that Sarah couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. They had settled in for the night, banking the fire and preparing for what they knew would be a difficult stretch of weather, when a crash from outside made them both jump. It was followed by the panicked whinnying of horses and a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold, the deep, guttural roar of a bear. "Stay inside," Elias commanded, grabbing his rifle from above the door. "Lock the door behind me." "No!" Sarah cried, but he was already out into the storm, moving as fast as his damaged leg would allow. Sarah stood frozen for only a second before her father's training kicked in. She knew that sound, knew what a bear attacking livestock meant. She also knew that Elias, for all his determination, was at a severe disadvantage in deep snow with his injury. Grabbing her father's hunting knife and a heavy iron skillet, Sarah plunged out into the storm. The scene that greeted her was chaos. A massive grizzly, probably awakened early from hibernation by hunger, had broken into the stable and was tearing at the door of the horse's stall. Elias was trying to get a clear shot, but his footing on the icy, snow-covered ground was treacherous. As Sarah watched in horror, his injured leg gave out, and he went down hard. The bear, sensing weakness, turned toward him. Sarah didn't think. She simply moved. She ran forward, screaming at the top of her lungs and banging the skillet against the knife to create as much noise as possible. The bear swung its massive head toward her, and for a moment Sarah stared into its small, dark eyes and understood that she might die here in the snow. But she didn't care. All she cared about was drawing the bear away from Elias, giving him time to get up, to get to safety. The bear charged. The rifle shot that rang out was deafening. The bear stumbled, roared, then turned and lumbered off into the trees, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Elias had managed to get a shot off even from his position on the ground. Sarah ran to him, falling to her knees in the snow beside him. "Are you hurt? Please tell me you're not hurt." "I'm fine," Elias gasped, trying to get up. "But I can't. My leg—" His leg had twisted badly in the fall, and the cold was already seeping in. Sarah could see him beginning to shake. She knew from her father that hypothermia could kill as surely as any bear. With strength born of desperation, Sarah got her arms under Elias's shoulders and began dragging him toward the cabin. He was heavy, far heavier than anything she'd ever tried to move, but she refused to stop, refused to give up. Her muscles screamed, her breath came in ragged gasps, but she kept going, one agonizing step at a time. By the time she got him inside and closed the door behind them, she was shaking as hard as he was. She stoked the fire until it roared, then helped Elias out of his wet clothes and wrapped him in every blanket she could find. His leg was swelling badly, and he was pale with pain and cold. Sarah worked through the night, keeping the fire blazing, warming water to get heat back into his body, checking his injured leg for signs of more serious damage. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, and each time he woke, his eyes would find her with an expression that made her heart ache. It was near dawn when he finally spoke clearly, his hand reaching out to catch hers. "Why did you do that?" he whispered. "Why did you risk yourself like that? I'm not worth dying for." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "Yes, you are," she said fiercely. "You're worth everything. I couldn't let anything happen to you because I—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat, but Elias's eyes were locked on hers, intense and demanding. "Because what?" he asked softly. "Because I love you," Sarah whispered, the truth finally breaking free. "I've loved you from almost the beginning, from the moment you knelt in the snow and treated me like I mattered, from every kindness, every gentle word, every time you showed me that I wasn't what they said I was. I love you, and I know I shouldn't. I know I'm not what you want, but I couldn't let you die without you knowing." Elias's hand tightened on hers. His other hand came up to touch her face, trembling slightly. "Sarah," he breathed, "look at me." She did, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. "I have loved you since the day you walked into my life," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you in every moment since, in ways I didn't think I was still capable of. I think about you every second of every day. I watch you move through this cabin and feel grateful just to exist in the same space. I've been teaching myself to walk better because I wanted to be more for you, to be someone you might not be ashamed of." "Ashamed?" Sarah gasped. "How could I ever be ashamed of you?" "Because I'm broken," Elias said. Because I'm old and damaged, and I can't give you the life you deserve. Because you're young and beautiful and full of light, and I'm just—" "You're the man I love," Sarah interrupted firmly. "You're the man who saw me when everyone else looked away. You're strong and kind and brave, and your leg has nothing to do with any of that. I don't care about any of the rest of it. I just care about you." Elias pulled her closer until their foreheads touched. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Then it's good we're not talking about deserve," Sarah said, smiling through her tears. "We're talking about love, and love doesn't have anything to do with deserving." When he kissed her, it was gentle and reverent, like she was something precious and fragile. Sarah kissed him back, pouring all her pent-up longing and love into the contact, and felt something inside her, something that had been broken and bleeding for as long as she could remember, finally begin to heal. They stayed like that as dawn broke over the mountains, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had believed themselves unworthy of love, proving themselves wrong with every breath. When spring came to Coldwater Ridge, it brought with it a thaw that was about more than just melting snow. Sarah and Elias emerged from their winter isolation as different people than they'd been when the cold set in. The wounds of the past had not disappeared, but they had transformed, no longer sources of shame, but reminders of how far they'd come. In late April, they made the journey down to Cotton Hollow, for the first time since Sarah's arrival. Word had spread through the small community about the bear attack and Sarah's heroic intervention, and for once, the looks they received were not of scorn, but of grudging respect. Even Margaret Carson, who Sarah had not spoken to since that terrible day, seemed uncertain how to treat her daughter now that she returned on the arm of Elias Stone, both of them standing tall despite their various injuries. But Sarah had no interest in her mother's approval anymore. She had found something far more valuable, the knowledge that she was worthy of love, not because of what she looked like or what she could do, but simply because she existed. They visited the old wooden church on the edge of town, where a traveling circuit preacher was holding services. The building was weathered and worn, much like everything else in Cotton Hollow, but the light streaming through its single stained glass window created patterns on the floor that seemed almost magical. After the service, Sarah and Elias approached the preacher. "We'd like to be married properly," Elias said, his arm around Sarah's waist, "with witnesses and vows and everything done right." The preacher, an elderly man with kind eyes, smiled. "I'd be honored." The wedding took place on a Sunday morning in May, when wildflowers carpeted the mountain meadows and the air smelled of pine and possibility. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Elias had trimmed his beard and worn his cleanest shirt. They had no rings, but Elias had carved 2 matching bands from mountain ash wood, smooth and beautiful in their simplicity. A handful of townspeople attended, more out of curiosity than support, but Sarah didn't care. All that mattered was Elias, standing beside her with tears in his eyes, promising to love and cherish her for all the days of his life. "I never thought I'd have this," he whispered to her as they exchanged their vows. "I never thought I'd be this happy again." "Neither did I," Sarah whispered back, "but we found it together." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in polite applause. But in that moment, Sarah and Elias heard nothing but each other's heartbeats, felt nothing but each other's warmth, saw nothing but the future stretching before them like an open road. They returned to their cabin on Cold Water Ridge as true partners in every sense of the word. The summer passed in a haze of contentment, with Sarah tending a garden she'd planted and Elias teaching her everything he knew about the mountains. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams, learning each other in the way that married people do, the small intimacies and quirks that make up a shared life. But it was in the fall, as the aspens turned gold and the air grew crisp, that Sarah realized she was carrying Elias's child. At first, she was terrified. Her own mother had been so cold, so cruel, and Sarah feared she might not know how to be different. But when she told Elias, watching his face carefully for any sign of regret or dismay, she saw only pure, unbridled joy. "A baby," he breathed, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Sarah, are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said, smiling at his wonder. "We're going to have a family," Elias said, and there were tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd never—" Sarah took his face in her hands and kissed him softly. "We get to start over," she said. "Both of us. We get to build something new, something that's ours alone." The pregnancy was not easy. Mountain winters were harsh, and there were times when Sarah felt sick and exhausted, when the weight of carrying a child seemed almost too much to bear. But Elias was there through all of it, patient and supportive, taking on extra work to lighten her load, sitting with her through the difficult nights, talking to her belly and telling their unborn child stories about the mountains and the wildlife and the life they would build together. When spring came again, their second together, Sarah's time drew near. They had made arrangements with a midwife from a neighboring settlement, but when Sarah's labor began in the middle of a rainstorm, there was no time to send for help. Elias would have to be the one to deliver their child. If he was afraid, he didn't show it. He boiled water, prepared clean cloths, and held Sarah's hand through every contraction, his voice steady and calm even when she could see the worry in his eyes. "You can do this," he told her again and again. "You're the strongest person I know. You fought off a grizzly bear for me, Sarah. You can do anything." And she did. After hours of labor that blurred together into a haze of pain and effort and determination, Sarah brought their son into the world. The baby's first cry was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, and when Elias placed the tiny red-faced bundle in her arms, Sarah felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "He's perfect," Elias whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "He's absolutely perfect." The baby had Elias's dark hair and strong features, but Sarah's nose and the delicate curve of her lips. He was healthy and loud and absolutely perfect in every way. They named him James, after Sarah's father, and as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the cabin on Cold Water Ridge filled with the sounds of family. James was a happy baby, quick to smile and curious about everything. Elias proved to be a devoted father despite his earlier fears, carrying his son in a sling against his chest as he did his daily work, talking to the baby about everything they saw. Sarah watched them together, her strong, gentle husband and their beautiful child, and felt a peace settle over her that she'd never imagined possible. The girl who had been thrown away, deemed worthless by her own mother, had found a love so deep and true it transformed everything it touched. One evening, as they sat by the fire with James sleeping between them, Sarah turned to Elias and said, "Do you remember what you said to me that first day about how no one had the right to throw me away?" Elias smiled, reaching over to take her hand. "I remember. I think about those words sometimes," Sarah continued, "because they changed my life. You changed my life. You saw me when I couldn't see myself." "You saved me too," Elias said softly. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You reminded me what it means to really live." "We saved each other," Sarah said, and it felt like the truest thing she'd ever spoken. Years would pass on Cold Water Ridge. Their little family would grow and change, weathering hardships and celebrating joys in equal measure. The people of Cotton Hollow would eventually come to respect the Stone family, seeing in them a kind of quiet strength that commanded admiration. Sarah's mother would never truly acknowledge the wrong she'd done, but Sarah learned to forgive her anyway, not because Margaret deserved it, but because carrying anger was too heavy a burden for a heart that had found happiness. Elias's leg would never fully heal, but it didn't matter. He had Sarah, who loved every part of him, and together they built a life that neither had thought possible in their darkest moments. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and James was asleep, Sarah and Elias would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, their hands clasped together, two souls who had been broken by the world and made whole by love. "I never knew I could be this happy," Sarah would say, as she had said 100 times before, and Elias would pull her close and reply, as he always did, "Neither did I. But love has a way of finding us, even when we think we're lost." In the end, that was the truth they had learned together, that love, real love, didn't care about what the world said you were worth. It didn't care about disabilities or appearance or past hurts. It simply was patient and kind and transformative, ready to heal the deepest wounds if you were brave enough to let it in. And they had been brave. Against all odds, against every voice that said they didn't deserve happiness, they had chosen to love and be loved. That choice had made all the difference.